How you doing? I want to take the chance to talk about Australia Day. For those of you who know me well, you know I love my rugby league. I'm a big rugby league fan. And I've got the NRL app on my phone. And one of their latest news articles, which was also put up on Facebook, is that Jonathan Thurston wants to start a conversation about Australia Day, which is completely reasonable. As an Australian, he has every right to do so. As an Indigenous person, he has every right to do so. As a human being, he has every right to discuss it because I believe in freedom of speech, and our country has a long history of encouraging people to share their opinions. So for those people out there who say he's a footballer, he should just stick to football. Well, the truth is, we are all able to speak on issues in society because that's what it means to be a society, as George Costanza would say to Jerry Seinfeld. We're trying to build a society here. As you can see, I love Seinfeld. So, first I want to reject the opinions of those who tell him he needs to be quiet because he's a football player. Look, football players, their main skill is being good at football. What's your main skill? Maybe you're a bricklayer. Maybe you're a lawyer. Maybe you work at Woolies. Maybe you're a carpenter. Maybe you're a dock worker. Maybe you're a taxi driver. I don't know what you do, but whatever it is you do, you should be free to speak on the political issues of the day. Now, in saying that, I do think the NRL takes big risks when it tries to be too political, because when we get into our football, when we watch the games, we don't want to really get into politics. So there is wisdom in not over-politicizing issues. But that being said, Jonathan Thurston is completely free and capable of sharing his opinion on this matter. And his view is that if many Australians talked about Australia Day and talked about the history of Australian white treatment of Indigenous people, that our opinions might change on Australia Day. And I just want to challenge this from a couple of perspectives. Firstly, he's assuming that we don't know the history of Australia. That's a pretty personally arrogant assumption. To assume that you're in the know and the people you're talking to aren't in the know because they have a different opinion, that's a mistake so many public figures make. Because you have this opinion, you obviously don't know what happened. In other words, it kind of makes out people to be stupider than they really are. I don't know very many Australians who don't know our history very well. They might not be able to talk about specific dates and specific events to the degree of some people, but most Australians know that we have an incredibly complicated and sad history with Indigenous Australians. That's just something that we know and we acknowledge. And we don't try to whitewash it on Australia Day, because Australia Day is not about celebrating the destruction of another culture. It's about celebrating the beginning of what Australia became. So first I want to challenge him on that perspective. Saying that if we knew what had happened in history we would change our minds isn't necessarily true. Perhaps that's true for some people, but I, for one, have studied Australian history at university. I've read up on different events. I know what Australian history is, and my view is that Australia Day is a good day to celebrate our National Day. The 26th of January is a really good day to celebrate our National Day. And I'll make a case for that in a minute. But I also want to challenge him from this perspective. Because Jonathan Thurston is such an incredible athlete, and he's an incredible Indigenous icon, and because he's incredibly proud of his culture, he feels free and is encouraged by the NRL and by the media to speak on his culture, because he's allowed to be proud of the culture of his Indigenous heritage, which is incredibly reasonable. He should be allowed to be proud of that Indigenous heritage. I'm not exactly sure who Jonathan Thurston's Indigenous forebearers were, or what people group, Indigenous people group he's from, but whoever it is, and to whatever extent he wants to celebrate that culture and influence young Indigenous boys and girls with his public image and inspire young people to be a success, I think that's really good. I love what Jonathan Thurston does in the public image. I don't know him as a person. I do know people who have known him for some time as a person, and they all say he's a great bloke, but I don't actually know him as a person. What I can see from his public image is that he's a hard worker, he's incredibly dedicated. I don't think there's a football game that Jonathan Thurston plays in where he's not the most passionate person on the field. I mean, maybe it's a Maybe it's just because it comes out in his demeanor a little bit more, but you see the passion with which he plays. I'm not even a Cowboys fan. I don't like the Cowboys as a team. Maybe I've just lost a big chunk of the people listening. But I am a Broncos fan. I've been a Broncos fan since I was born, even though I was born in 1984, and they didn't come till 1988. I still say that. You have to forgive me for that one. So I think that it's great that Jonathan Thurston wants to celebrate his Indigenous history. Now, Indigenous history is not perfect. These were not tribes of hippie-style, peaceful forest dwellers who never harmed anyone and just lived peaceful lives until the white man came along and introduced them to violence. Indigenous people had wars with each other. Indigenous people had wars with white people, sometimes because they were provoked, sometimes because they wanted to attack. Indigenous history, just like any other human history, is flawed. It's imperfect. There's no such thing as a human culture or human people group in the world which has a perfect and flawless culture. And this is certainly true of British culture in general and Western culture in general. British culture, Western culture is not perfect as well. Our cultures are not perfect. But those of us who have British and Western European heritage, we're sick of being told that we have to be particularly guilty, or we have to feel particularly guilty about our cultural heritage, when other cultures, which are also flawed and imperfect, don't have to feel guilty about their cultural heritage. Yes, British culture had flaws in it, but it also brought us the Magna Carta. It also brought us the Westminster system of government, which we still have today, which gives us an incredibly strong democracy. In fact, the constitutional and monarchical system is actually one of the strongest forms of and most stable forms of government in the whole world. So to say that only an Indigenous person in Australia can be proud of their history, or a minority can be proud of their history, and those of us of British heritage are not allowed to be proud of our history, despite its flaws, we recognize it's not perfect, is incredibly ridiculous. And there are those of us who are just sick of being told that we cannot celebrate our history. Now, it doesn't mean we celebrate everything about our history. We recognize that bad things happened. But that can be said about every single culture in the world. Every single culture in the world. And if you take one quick look at the world today, most of the most successful nations in the world are those with British colonial heritage. And there's a reason for that, because the legal systems, the cultural pillars upon which these civilizations were built, or this civilization was built, is incredibly strong. Western civilization is successful for so many reasons, but largely because it values the individual and wants to allow the individual an opportunity to improve their life. And we should be able to celebrate this. We should be able to celebrate Western culture, and if those of us with British history, we should be allowed to celebrate our British history and not be told that we just have to feel guilty about things that people did a couple hundred years ago or 100 years ago. We can acknowledge what they did was wrong, but we should also be able to celebrate, just as those of other cultures are told they are able to. Which leads me to my point. Why celebrate Australia Day? Well, I think January 26th is a good day to celebrate Australia Day for this reason. Because when that first fleet landed, and for some reason people confuse Australia Day with the coming of Captain Cook. Captain Cook came earlier than 1788. When the first fleet arrived, it brought a disparate group of soldiers, officers, prisoners, tradespeople, and all sorts of different stuff. Many of whom were sick from the long voyage, because let's face it, sailing across the world in that day and age was not easy. Not easy to do at all, and it was often physically taxing, and a lot of people died on the journey from ships sinking or from scurvy or from some other terrible thing happening. So they risked their lives, they risked the lives of their prisoners to bring them to Australia, and they came to the shores of Botany Bay. And they started what became what I would consider one of the greatest nations on earth. And so celebrating Australia Day on the 26th of January is incredibly reasonable, because that was the beginning of what Australia was to become. Now, I acknowledge that bad stuff happened after that day. There were some terrible massacres which happened from Aussie settlers attacking Indigenous communities throughout the history of Australian and Indigenous peoples' relations. When these settlers came, disease came with them, and that's just an unfortunate side effect of the Indigenous people having been separated from the rest of the world for so long and not raising cattle and livestock and such, and getting those natural immunities that the more established societies had gained from agriculture. So that was a terrible side effect, and many Indigenous people who lost their lives, it was because of the sicknesses that spread through the culture because of that contact with white men. If they could go back in time and find some way to inoculate these people, that would be an awesome thing to be able to do, but it's impossible. So terrible stuff did happen. We acknowledge that. And it's really sucky. But could you imagine if Australia was settled by the Mongols? The Mongols traveled across, the Asian, the Mongolian plains, Russia, down into the Middle East, far into China. I believe they even sent some ships to Japan at one point. Eventually, they got into Europe and went pretty far before they, were stopped, before they withdrew. We got lucky, and they decided to leave. Now, these people would destroy entire villages that resisted their rule. They killed millions of people. They leveled Baghdad, which in the ancient world was one of the most beautiful and incredible cities in the ancient world. And this isn't even that ancient. This is like, just a few hundred years ago. They leveled it because the people of Baghdad resisted them. They raped women, they murdered people, they did all sorts of cruel stuff. They had incredibly strict discipline. Could you imagine if the Mongolian people had settled in Australia? The decimation that would have come. The Spanish conquistadors, the way they treated the peoples of South America was terrible. Now, this is not to say that the British didn't do bad things. But those of us who want to celebrate Australia Day, one of the things that we want to do is celebrate our British and even our British colonial heritage, because all ancient societies were flawed. Even all modern societies are flawed. We think we've progressed a long way, but we kill 70,000 babies in the womb roundabouts each year in Australia. That's a lot of death. That's a lot of murder every year. So we haven't progressed as far as we think. People call that progression, but we've just gone back to the old infanticide that the Greeks and the Romans did, except we do it with a much better technology. So we can do it before birth. And so people do it, and it makes it easier because they never have to see the effects of that. Although that's debatable because some people have really bad depression afterwards. But even in saying that, the modern world has progressed in a lot of ways. But if you go back to the colonial era, the British people, the British colonialists, what they would do when they settled into an area is they would start to engage with the people, they would start to build, they would start to educate, they would take people from those groups and they would train them how to speak English and how to write. And then they would often, which is one thing a lot of people don't know, they would actually teach these people to speak and write in their own language. Now, they had a lot of trouble with the Indigenous people in doing this because the cultures were so far separated and they weren't able to do it very well. By separated, I mean just very different in language. They weren't able to really learn the Indigenous language like they could in other countries for a long time. I mean, so those of us who want to celebrate Australia Day, we're just like Jonathan Thurston. We want to celebrate our heritage, knowing that it's flawed, knowing that it's not perfect, but knowing that there are things in our British and Australian history that we can be proud of. And what we can be certainly proud of is that we no longer treat Indigenous people like they used to. The way they treated Indigenous people for a long time in Australia was terrible. The way Indigenous soldiers were treated after coming back from World War I and World War II was terrible. The fact that it took so long for Indigenous people to get the vote was terrible. The fact that there was massacres is terrible. We can acknowledge all of that. But Australia is the country it is today because of January 1788. And that's just a fact. And that's why it makes sense to celebrate Australia Day on this date. Now, there's more which can be said, but I don't want to put up a super long video. I'd love to hear your thoughts, so make some comments, let me know what you think. This is Pastor Matt signing off. Catch you later.